Good morning, party people. So today is the third. We're on video number 2 for Nehemiah chapter 9. So like I mentioned in the last video, right now in Nehemiah, they'd been reading the book of the law. Many of the people that were present for reading the book of the law had not heard the book of the law. Remember, there had been a diaspora. Many of them had been separated from Israel, the temple, the worship had not been going on. So all of their normal functions that had been going on, prior to the fall of Assyria and Babylon, they hadn't been practicing. So they hadn't been hearing the word of the Lord on a regular basis. So here they begin, after they've established the wall in Jerusalem, they've established the worship, and now they begin a reading of the word of the Lord. And that brings about a great repentance. And you see here in chapter 9, what we're seeing is almost the entire chapter is a psalm that is considered one of the most premier psalms in the Old Testament. They compare it to the Song of Deborah, the Song of David's Song of the Bow, the Song of Hannah when she became pregnant. So it's considered just a powerful, powerful psalm, and it's a wonderful psalm to read, just to constantly recognize who God is, God's faithfulness and his promises, how God has chosen us, we have not chosen him, and that he's faithful when we're not faithful. And so that's what this psalm is going through. So they'd already been reading the word of the Lord and worshiping for 3 weeks when they start this. And so the Levites stand before the people and begin to confess their sins. So we're already on verse 13. They've already confessed who God is, how God has led them and rescued them out of Egypt. Even when they had sinned, God was still faithful, and God rescued them out of Egypt, and he led them by a pillar of fire and by a cloud, right? So now it says, verse 13, you came down also on Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven. You gave them just ordinances and true laws. So good statutes and commandments. Okay, so there God's coming down, right? That's very clear. They can't go up just like the Tower of Babel. God came down to look to see what they were doing on the Tower of Babel. So same thing here. God came down on Mount Sinai to give them the 10 Commandments, right? And then in verse 14, you made known to them your holy Sabbath and commanded them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hand of Moses, your servant. So it's very interesting here in verse 14 that they bring up the Sabbath, right? There's a lot more going on with the Sabbath than I think we really understand. That alone would be an awesome Bible study just on what the Sabbath represents. I wanted to say today in our study, in our daily reading, I thought was very interesting. Something, I don't know how many times I've read this, but today our daily reading was in Leviticus, right? So chapter 23 in Leviticus, it says Feasts of the Lord. So chapter 23 goes through the entire chapter. Is all it's about in Leviticus is about the feasts of the Lord and what they are and why they're supposed to celebrate them, right? Well, the very first feast of the Lord that's mentioned is the Sabbath. It's the Sabbath. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. And then it goes on to talk about the Passover and the Feast of Weeks, and then the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Tabernacles. So I'm like, what? I mean, I've read that I don't even know how many times that I've never realized that it's placed there when it's mentioning the feasts. So again, you see in this psalm that it's mentioned. I mean, so there's something going on here that would really, I think, requires to be honored. We should do a study on that. So if you have time, do a study on the Sabbath, because it's really highlighted in places that can be surprising. So here it says in verse 14, you made known to them your holy Sabbath and commanded them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hand of Moses your servant. Verse 15, you gave them bread from heaven for their hunger and brought them water out of the rock for their thirst. You told them to go to possess the land which you had sworn to give them. So there, when they're talking about the water out of the rock and the bread from heaven, those are all symbolic of Jesus, right? He is the bread from heaven, and out of him flows rivers of living water, which we should be functioning in the same way, right? With as followers of Jesus Christ, we should be giving food to people, right? Food from heaven, right? And there should be flowing out of us rivers of life. Like, we should be functioning as life. Everywhere we go, we should be bringing life, right? And so But again, that also represents God caring for them in the midst of the wickedness that they did on their way to the promised land. So even in all that mess, God was still providing for them, right? Verse 16, but they and our fathers acted proudly, hardened their necks, and did not heed your commandments. So this is when he's talking about the judges and the kings, right? The judges and the kings were just a mess. We studied in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the kings, the story of the kings and the divided nation. And so you see the same thing in Judges. Everything's a mess. They and our fathers acted proudly, hardened their necks, and did not heed your commandments. They refused to obey, and they were not mindful of your wonders that you did among them. But they hardened their necks, and in their rebellion they appointed a leader to return to their bondage. So there they're talking about when they were in the wilderness, back when they went up to spy out the land, and they came back and only two of them said, Joshua and the other Caleb said, yes, we can do it, we can do it. And the other 10 spies were like, no, we can't do it, we can't do it. And so then they appointed a leader. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back to slavery because they didn't want to trust God. So that's what they're referring to here. But you are God, ready to pardon, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abundant in kindness, and did not forsake them, even in the midst of their mess. Even when they made a molded calf for themselves, which is the same time frame. And they said, this is your God that brought you up out of Egypt and worked great provocations. Yet in your manifold mercies you did not forsake them in the wilderness. The pillar of the cloud did not depart from them by day to lead them on the road, nor the pillar of fire by night to show them light and the way they should go. So this is so crazy to me. Okay, and this is a good thing for us to remember. So in the midst of them having the God's presence with them, they had the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and he was feeding them, right? And in the midst of that, they were still denying him and wanting to go back to Egypt, and they built a calf and said, this is your God. I mean, to me, that's just craziness. So we have to think about that today is, are we doing the same thing, right? We don't have those tangible things like that, but there's no doubt if you reflect on your life, there's no way you can say that God is not walking with you and and providing for you, and you just cannot help but see God's hand on your life if you really take time to look. And so even and this shows you that even if we had those things, there's going to be times when people are going to turn from God and say, that it's not real or whatever. I mean, it's just, to me, crazy that with all of that, they are still completely in rebellion. I mean, with the tangible presence, they're still in rebellion. And then it says, you gave for your good spirit to instruct them, and you did not withhold your manna from their mouth, and you gave them water for their thirst. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness. They lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. So again, that's just reminders that in the midst of all that, they were still turning away from God. Moreover, you gave them kingdoms and nations and divided them into districts, so they took possession of the land of Sion, the land of the king of Heshbon, and the land of Og, king of Bashan. You also multiplied their children as the stars of heaven and brought them into the land which you had told their fathers to go in and possess. So the people went in and possessed the land. You subdued before them the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, and gave them into their hands with their kings and the people of the land, that they might do with them as they wished. And they took strong cities and a rich land and possessed houses full of all goods, cisterns already dug, vineyards, olive groves, and fruit trees in abundance. So they ate and were filled and grew fat and delighted themselves in your great goodness. They're saying that when they took over these lands that God had promised them, they took it over in such a way that many times the houses and the cities were left intact. The crops were still in the ground, and they were able to just walk in and take possession. Nevertheless, they were disobedient and rebelled against you, cast your law behind their backs, and killed your prophets who testified against them to turn them to yourself. And they worked great provocations. Therefore, you delivered them into the hand of their enemies who oppressed them. And in the time of their trouble, when they cried to you, you heard from heaven, and according to your abundant mercies, you gave them deliverers who saved them from the hand of their enemies. So I'm running out of time to finish this. So basically what I want to just say at the very end here, they go through... Read chapter 9 because it's amazing. And at the very end, he goes to say that here we are, even all the things you've done, here we are in this mess again, and we're serving other people. You brought us back, but we are still servants to other kings instead of to the great king, to you. And so they're just repenting. So it's an awesome section. Please take time to read it. Read your Bible. Jesus is coming, and we'll do number 10 tomorrow. Peace.